Okay, I'm going to get started and people can just come in as they need to. Thanks everyone for joining so far. I'm Rachel Gilbert, and I don't know if I've been in touch with all of you here, but I'm a researcher based at Tufts University in Boston. I'm working on the Food Prices for Nutrition project. I'm really excited to have you guys here to talk about the role of food prices in India. We're talking about measuring and monitoring the cost and affordability of healthy diets. This work has been going on for about 6 years or so now. Some of you may be familiar with the Changing Access to Nutritious Diets in Africa and South Asia project, or Kandasa. So the Food Prices for Nutrition project is the latest iteration of the work that developed the methods and indicators to measure nutritious diet costs. This work has come a long way. Food prices and diet cost metrics are now being used alongside other measures of food security in the UN multi-agency reports, the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World, or the SOFI. And this has been a really exciting development, and there's a lot more going on in the next 4 years of this project. So our goal for today is to tell you about some previous work and ongoing work, so we can start to engage more in India and on a deeper level to start linking different aspects of food systems with better nutrition, different agricultural practices through these metrics. So I'm also very excited to have Dr. Kalyani Raghunathan from the International Food Policy Research Institute here today, which will be presenting some of her work. So that will be very exciting to have another presenter here. And I know it's a very busy time, so just to make the best use of our time, just a quick set of logistics. I'll be recording this webinar. Hopefully you got a notification when you joined that we're already recording. I will post the recording and the slides online. I'll do that almost immediately after the webinar, and we'll also share it with everyone who registered. So during the presentation, I'll try and have everyone keep themselves muted and with their video off for the time being. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat now. Let us know where you're joining from, organization-wise, in the world-wise, and your name. And definitely feel free during the Q&A sessions. There'll be 2 separate times to turn on your mic, turn on your video if you'd like, and join in. Any burning questions that you'd like to share during the presentation, please feel free to do so in the chat. I'll try and monitor those when Kalyani's presenting and at the end. So please feel free to share them then. And yeah, we'll just get started right away then. I'm starting here with the vision for the project, which is really based in a vision that's very familiar to most people, which is focused around food security. So many of you will be familiar with this definition. It's been used very widely in the global community for about 25 years now. So when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. I'm sure many of you have heard that before. So the reason to start here is because this framework provides a very strong vision, which many food systems are still not able to achieve after so many years. So in this project, something that we're very focused on is the availability and affordability aspects of physical and economic access. And then we're also focused on nutritious foods to meet dietary needs. So moving beyond just nutrient needs, encompassing dignity, culture, and protection of health, not just in the short term, but in the long term, and against things such as non-communicable disease and the like. So these words have been swirling around for a long time, but it's been very hard to achieve this vision, in part because we haven't had accountability to this, understanding availability and affordability of healthy diets. So that's a lot of what this project aims to do. And more specifically, the central questions about availability and affordability that we're trying to answer in the Food Prices for Nutrition project is really, if you went to a market in India, how much would it cost to obtain nutritious food to meet dietary needs? And then how many people in India can afford that cost? So the answer to these questions are really based in markets and in retail prices. In terms of food systems, these metrics being based in markets allows us to think about how the whole food system is performing in bringing healthy food to consumers. And many people, when they hear retail prices and consumers, the first thing they think of is how much food is produced at home and how many people receive food through gifts or possibly through social safety net programs and even collecting foods from the wild. And of course, these things are very important, but it's also true that even rural households rely on market purchases for healthy and diverse diets. So this is recent evidence from rural India, from Sumya Gupta and colleagues. I don't know if Sumya made it onto the call, but this is great evidence of this. So on the vertical axis here, we have the percentage of households that purchased each food group in the past week. And you can see that perishable and nutrient-rich items like vegetables are purchased by almost all households. Then there's things like meat, fish, and eggs, which are purchased by approximately half of all households, with some differences throughout the year. And things like oils, which are of course very difficult to produce at the household level, are also things which are very commonly purchased. So I say all of this, and I use this evidence to underscore that market reliance is very important for overall and seasonal access to many food groups in many places all over the world, even when people are producing their own food as well or gathering it. So purchased foods from markets are very important for the availability of diverse and healthy diets. And to answer the questions that I posed earlier about the availability and affordability of healthy diets and about their retail cost, we use 3 different benchmark least cost diets. So the first diet is considered the energy sufficient diet, sometimes called the cost of calorie adequacy. And this represents the minimum cost to meet energy requirements using the least expensive available starchy staple in each country. So for example, this would be the cost for a person to buy enough rice to meet their calorie needs for a day. And this is basically just short-term survival. And this is fairly commonly used as a measure of food security, as being able to meet caloric needs. That's not how we use it, but that is how it's been used very frequently. So the next diet is the nutrient adequate diet, or the cost of nutrient adequacy. Sometimes you'll see it called CONA. This is calculated as the minimum cost to meet energy and nutrient requirements for macro and micronutrients. And this is taking into account both avoidance of deficiencies and toxicities, so sort of between upper and lower bounds of intakes. And we consider this to be a theoretical benchmark. It's very difficult for a person to go to a market and know the exact amount of fruits and vegetables that they would need to meet exactly the lowest cost diet. But what it does represent is a bare minimum of what it would cost to meet one's nutrient needs. That's even theoretically possible in that market. And then the final diet is the healthy diet, or the cost of a recommended diet. You'll see it later on in the presentation referred to as CORD, the cost of a recommended diet. So these metrics, this metric represents the minimum cost to meet food-based dietary guidelines. So those are based on food group classifications. Not all countries have food-based dietary guidelines, but fortunately India does. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but dietary guidelines are really a behaviorally realistic way for people to meet nutrient and other needs. As I mentioned before, this includes protection against non-communicable disease and cultural norms as well. They're national guidelines, generally speaking. So they do incorporate culture and social norms. And these are usually official government strategy for communicating with people about what they should eat. So a little bit more on least cost diets. I want to emphasize that when I'm talking about least cost diets, we're focused on the minimum cost theoretically possible, which is why we've been referring to them as benchmark diets. So they're the cheapest, looking at the cheapest food items with the lowest cost overall. And I also want to emphasize that there's no standard food basket that's identified here. We're basically selecting foods based on the time and place and their cost at that time and place in the markets where we have that data, for example. So there's no guideline that would say there's always going to be rice, peas, and carrots in the diet. You may have, for example, for leafy greens, you may have amaranth in the basket at one time of the year, and then later that may become less expensive or more expensive, and another leafy green would come in to the basket. So really, there's no there's no one set basket, and seasonal and locally available foods can be incorporated throughout the year. So this is actually some work by Kalyani, but I don't think she'll be presenting this later. So this is just emphasizing the point that the least cost diet is not uniform across geography. So these are the most common items in the cost of a healthy diet by state. So obviously this is just a selection of states, but you can see here, for example, just with the fruits, each state has a different group of least cost items. There are some similarities. So you'll see bananas are very frequently pictured in the healthy diet basket, but in some places there's guava, papaya, pineapple, mango. So again, different foods are coming in, and you can see that for other food groups as well. So the final point I want to emphasize about least cost diet methods, that they're a conservative lower estimate of the cost per day. So things like preferences or convenience would add to the cost of the diet. So if you wanted to think about, for example, prepared or canned foods, those are generally more expensive. So they're not usually included in least cost diets. So these are really considered to be a conservative lower bound of what the cost would be per day. And we like to visualize this with something we call the ladder of affordability. So here you can see at the very bottom, we have the least expensive diet, which is, or benchmark diet, which is caloric adequacy. It's just achieving short-term subsistence. Again, it's often mistaken for food security, but actually this is just the bare minimum for short-term survival. In order to get to nutrient adequacy, where we can avoid deficiencies or excesses of essential nutrients, it costs a little bit more. So we go up a step. And then we have healthy diets up another step, which means they're even more expensive. So in order to meet food group recommendations and proportionality goals, we pay a bit more. And then finally, incorporating preferences and convenience, the cost rises again. So the ladder of affordability is useful in highlighting two really important insights. The first thing is that when all diets are affordable, when people can afford a healthy diet, food prices are really just one of many influences on food choice. We know that people choose to buy certain foods for many, many reasons, including taste and, ease of cooking and other things. But when healthy diets are unaffordable, food prices are truly an insurmountable barrier to improving diet quality. And this is really important, especially when you're thinking about all of the programming, which focuses on nutrition education or helping people understand what is a healthy diet. Many of those things aren't useful if you can't actually, or not, I shouldn't say not useful, are less useful if you cannot actually afford to buy a healthier diet. So with that, I just want to talk a little bit about sources of price data, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the metrics that I just introduced. So I'll talk about general sources of price data, and I think Kalyani will talk a little bit more in her presentation about the price data that she used in her work. Excuse me, I'm just going to grab a sip of water. And anyone who's in this call who has experience either collecting or working with any of the types of price data that I'm talking about, please share your experience in the chat box, or feel free to mention additional points in the chat as well. So to start, some examples of different sources of food price data. The first is prices which are collected by agri-food agencies. So for example, an agricultural ministry, these usually collect market information systems data, commonly tracking farm gate or wholesale, or sometimes also retail food price data. So sometimes they're focused on basic commodities, more often they're focused on basic commodities and fewer processed foods or sort of perishable foods. There's also data from early warning systems. So things, prices that are collected by organizations like the World Food Program. These are generally used to guide food aid in emergency settings. And they are usually prices of staple or basic foods. The key point here is that they're rapidly available, generally for fewer foods for that reason. But they're usually also at markets in vulnerable areas. And then there's other sources of price data, such as those collected by national statistical organizations. So in almost all countries now, there is food price data collection for the Consumer Price Index. So in India, that's collected by the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. And these are usually the prices of frequently consumed products. They're collected at regular intervals, often monthly, and they are official government data, and they are generally representative in some form. And the World Bank International Comparison Program is a really unique data set that we're highlighting here because we've used it in some of our work. It is a global data set of retail prices, and it is actually from the data that's collected by country governments. So it's used in the UN multi-agency report, the SOFI report. So that's sort of why we mention it here, as well as to mention that in the most recent rounds, the most recent rounds are 2011, 2017, there were 208 food and beverage items in the global list. So it's a very rich and large data set. And then there's also regionally specific lists. So items in this data set are limited to comparable products, which are consumed in multiple countries because they're used for the purchasing power parity calculations, which a high level of comparability is needed. So ultimately, this data set provides a national annual average price per item, and it's very useful for global comparison. So in some of the work that we've done, you'll see the ICP data as well. So the main food price data that we recommend and use often in the work that's being done is official government data. As I mentioned, the data that's being collected for the calculation of the CPI. So this is generally used for measuring inflation, which is again calculated in the Consumer Price Index. So for example, usually a government will collect high frequency data. So in India, the data is available on a monthly basis for about 100 foods. And because the Consumer Price Index uses weights derived from the share of total expenditures, these foods are by definition culturally acceptable and commonly consumed foods. So these are the foods that are tracked in the government data on a monthly basis. And this is a huge undertaking in many countries, and usually includes things like fruits and vegetables and the types of nutrient-dense foods that are very useful or necessary for calculating the cost of a healthy diet. And one of the reasons we focus on this is that one of the major focuses of the Food Prices for Nutrition project is to leverage the huge amount of food price data that already exists in the world and to use it for nutrition and to use it to shift food policy towards better nutrition. So there's many cases and many other projects which are focused on collecting food price data, and really our intention in this project is to leverage existing data systems, either national or international systems, and use that for nutrition. So thinking about all this food price data now, I'm going to talk about how this can be used to calculate the metrics. I won't focus too much on the cost of caloric adequacy because it's basically a simpler form of the cost of nutrient adequacy. So we'll take in order to calculate the cost of nutrient adequacy, which is a little bit more labor intensive than the cost of a healthy diet, we would take the food price data, so any of the forms we just discussed, and combine it with food composition data, so things that tell us the calorie and nutrient content of foods. Then we use linear programming to find the cheapest or lowest cost solution to the question of which combination of foods can meet all of the nutrient needs and energy requirements at the least cost. So linear programming does require the use of statistical or data analysis software to be run, and it does take into consideration all of the possible diet combinations in order to find the cheapest combination. So it's a computationally intensive process, and it's generally used for one-time sort of big intervention planning efforts. So for example, Fill the Nutrient Gap has done an amazing job of using a very similar calculation to the cost of nutrient adequacy to plan interventions, things like large-scale fortification, et cetera. But it is a computationally intensive process. The energy and nutrient requirements in the cost of nutrient adequacy, I won't go into too much detail here. I'll just share this resource. They'll be available in the slides later, that my colleagues Kate and Anna Herforth put together. But essentially the energy and nutrient requirements that are used for the linear programming start with caloric needs. So basic energy, estimated energy requirements based on age, sex, etc. Then there's the incorporation of macronutrients, so proteins, fats, carbohydrates, using the AMDRs, or the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. So that specifies a range of acceptable proportions of calories for each macronutrient. And then there's the micronutrients. So there's lower and upper bounds for 23 micronutrients, and that's to avoid toxicity again and avoid deficiency. So there's multiple ways to do that. And I think some of this is discussed in the software tools resource right here. Things like recommended daily allowances can be used to set the upper and lower bounds, or for example, estimated average requirements and upper limits. But again, these are an input into the linear programming model, which then solves to find the combination and quantities of foods that meet all of the requirements at the lowest cost. For the cost of a healthy diet, or CORD, cost of a recommended diet, the first step is, of course, to operationalize what a healthy diet is. So, of course, there's no single definition of a healthy diet, but in this case, we're operationalizing it as a recommended diet based on a quantitative food-based dietary guideline. So about 100 countries in the world, including India, have food-based dietary guidelines. FAO does an amazing job of tracking these in their online repository, but national food-based dietary guidelines, I'm sorry, if anyone here has been involved in the development of them, please do also feel free to jump in the chat. There's sort of convergence across broad food-based dietary guidelines in the world, but not all of them are quantitative. So here we have just some examples of the few that are quantitative, detailed food-based dietary guidelines. So India, for example, Benin, Vietnam. And these are really needed in order to set the balance for the cost of a healthy diet. So usually we need things like how many servings are recommended per day, what a serving size is in grams. These are the types of quantitative information that's necessary. Excuse me. So here's a snapshot of the India's quantitative food-based dietary guidelines. So again, this is an example of a quantitative detailed guideline. So I'm just showing you here that the different food groups. And then this is important for calculating the cost of the healthy diet. So we need to be able to categorize foods in a food price list into food groups, because there are recommendations for each food group. So here we'll have cereals and pulses, milk and milk products. The second piece of information we need for the cost of a healthy diet is the number of servings that are recommended per day. So there's a range. You can see here for cereals and millets, there's 15 servings per day for a man using moderate activity, and 11 for a woman. So you can see that there's also portion sizes. So those portions are quantified. Over here, you can see this, for example, one serving of cereals and millets is about 30 grams. So then the recommended amount per day is equal to the portion size times the number of portions per day. And this is the information that you need to calculate the cost of a healthy diet. So specifically, in order to calculate the cost of a healthy diet, which does not, again, require any linear programming, like the cost of a nutrient adequate diet does, the first step is to, again, you have a list of food prices that are collected for a set of foods, is to categorize each food in the food price list according to the food groups in that guideline. So for example, cereals and millets, pulses, etc. And then there's the process of removing certain items. So things which are not required for a healthy diet, things like sweets or sugar sweetened beverages, condiments, these things add to the cost and they add calories, but they're actually extraneous to dietary needs. So those are removed, as well as duplicate items, such as different versions of rice. So for example, local rice versus imported rice, you would keep whichever is the least expensive. And that's just to incorporate a diverse diet, both across and within food groups. So in the third step, we would take the price, you would calculate the price per day. And you start with the price per kilogram, and then the price per day becomes the taking into account the edible portion of that food, the number of servings required for the food group to meet the serving requirement. So for example, if you needed to have 3 to 5 servings of 220 grams of rice, you would account for the parts of the food that can't be eaten. So for rice, that's nothing, everything can be eaten. But for something like fish, there may be bones that couldn't be eaten, or for example, with an avocado or a melon, there's pits or rinds that can't be eaten. So ultimately, we take the recommended quantity per day times the price per kilogram, accounting for that portion of the food that can't be consumed. And then the final, the next step is to take the average of the cheapest items in the food group. So in some cases, you're going to just take one of the lowest cost items. For example, for oils, we just take the cheapest item. For fruits, it would be the average cost of the 2 cheapest items, and then maybe 3 for vegetables. And that's because in some cases, there's truly in the dietary guideline an explicit requirement for that, but it's also to incorporate, again, diversity within the food groups. Then the final step is to sum the cost for all food groups and get the total diet cost. Excuse me. So finally, I want to just move into the affordability of diet. So affordability is the comparison of the cost of something relative to a defined income standard. So one possible standard for affordability is to use a national or an international poverty line. So the total international poverty line, for example, of $1.90. You can also compare these diet costs to something like food expenditures, which can often be taken from household survey data. And then total income is, of course, another option if that data is available. And then finally, Kalyani will talk a little bit more about this, but comparison to wages. So usually the comparison for affordability is context specific and depends on what data is available. Just a quick example, in the SOPHI 2020 report, we used the international poverty line as a comparison. So this is the average cost across 10 different national food-based dietary guidelines, as well as the Eat Lancet guidelines. The median cost of the least cost healthy diet was about $3.50 per person per day. And I show you this because we compared it to the international poverty line, about $1.90 a day for both food and non-food. And you can see that really by any definition, healthy diets are far more expensive than that international poverty line, which was a really important insight from the SOPHI report, as well as noting that when you look at the $1.20 that's credibly reserved for just for food, it's also still, again, considerably higher than that cost. So that's how the affordability data can be really useful in highlighting gaps in how we consider these topics, and how best to think about social safety nets, for example. And before I turn over to Kalyani, I just want to quickly highlight how this initiative, the Food Prices for Nutrition Initiative, and what I've just been talking about is different from or building on other initiatives or work we've done in the past. So the main focus here is really on monitoring. So we're looking over time and seasons to have current statistics and using very recent data to look at how access to healthy diets is changing from month to month in different markets. And to do this, again, we're really focused on leveraging existing sources of data. Again, one of these systems might be the Consumer Price Index data or other national food price systems or international systems of food price data collection. Another slight difference from some other initiatives is that we're really moving beyond individual nutrients with the cost of a healthy diet to look at healthy diet patterns that have other benefits, including proportionality and cultural norms, as well as protection of long-term health. And the final point I'll make is, again, that the cost of a healthy diet, in contrast to the cost of a nutrient adequate diet, does not rely on linear programming. So it's a relatively easy computation and it's very well suited for monitoring. So we're really focused on that partially for the just logistical reason of having it be easier, but also because philosophically, these are behavioral realistic ways for people to actually meet their nutrient and long-term health goals is by eating a recommended diet. So you just see a couple initiatives here that use sort of the cost of a nutrient adequate diet or similar initiatives. And we're actually working and in conversation with groups like the World Food Program's Fill the Nutrient Gap to harmonize our efforts and look at how both of the indicators can be really useful. And with all of that, I am going to turn it over to Kalyani, who will present on her national level work. So she's presenting on behalf of the International Food Policy Research Institute, for those of you who weren't here when I started. And Kalyani, I will just mute myself.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Do you want to go to the next slide and I can just get started immediately? Great. So as Rachel mentioned, the food prices for nutrition is the second the second wave of a set of projects that have been looking at estimating the cost of nutritious diets. And so I'll present work that we did under the predecessor to FPN, which was a Changing Access to Nutritious Diets in Africa and South Asia, the CANDASA project that some of you might be familiar with. And then I'll move into work that we're doing with more updated price data that comes under the FPN project and hopefully brings all of these results more up to date. And so I'll begin with the paper in Food Policy that came out earlier this year on the affordability of nutritious diets in India. And Rachel has done a really good job of kind of setting the stage on how to calculate the code. So I'm not going to go into those details, but we use India's food-based dietary guidelines in order to calculate the cost of a recommended diet for rural India. The food-based dietary guidelines specify 6 different food groups. And as Rachel showed in that sheet from the National Institute of Nutrition, there's a portion size and a number of portions for each. And then importantly for our work, these are separated by gender and also by activity intensity. So we use the National Sample Survey data, the Rural Price and Wage data set, which spans the time period from October 2001 to June 2011. It covers about 380 districts from 24 states and has price information on about 100 items or commodities. Next slide. And then in order to get at the affordability piece, as Rachel mentioned in her presentation, we add in information on wages to assess how cord as a proportion of wages has changed over time. And we do that again for men and women. So what's nice is that the same rural price and wage data set also has wage information for in cash and in kind payments for men and women for 18 different occupations. But because we're interested in how the poor are going to be able to afford or not afford these diets, we limit our attention to cash wages of unskilled laborers as a good proxy for the income of the poor. Next. So I'll start with just calculating the price per serving over time. And this is, as Rachel mentioned, converting the price per kilograms using the serving sizes and the edible portions of those foods into the cost per serving. And so on the left-hand side, we have the price per serving in 2001, separated by the different food groups. And you'll note that dark green leafy vegetables, the rightmost category is indicated as a separate food group because India's food-based dietary guidelines do require that one of the vegetables you eat is a dark green leafy vegetable. So the dispersion of points within each food group represents the cost across items and at different points in that year across months. And then the diamond is the average in food groups across all items. So we have a panel on the left, which is 2001, and then on the right is 2011, which is the beginning and end of our time series. And one thing to note is that dairy has the highest average price per serving at both time points, and it's followed closely by fruits and vegetables and proteins. And the second thing is, if you just look at those two figures taken together, both the dispersion of average price per serving across items within food groups, as well as the overall average price for each food group, both of those have increased over time. So we see a greater spread, but we also see higher average price per servings in 2011. Next slide. So using the information we have on price per serving and then the table from NIN on number of servings for men and women, we can calculate the chord. What we show here is the average chord. So this is the average number of serving sizes across men and women, wherever there is a discrepancy. And over the course of the time span of our data set, we find that the chord in real terms has increased more than threefold. So what we have here is the height of each bar represents the chord in the cost of a recommended diet in 2011 rupees. And you can see that that goes from 13.9 in 2001 all the way to about 51 rupees in 2011. And then each bar is broken down into each of its components. So you can actually see how much cereals or dairy or proteins contribute to the overall cost of that recommended diet. So you'll note that the bright blue bar, which is in the center of all of these, which is a contribution of dairy, is actually the largest. So dairy is the single biggest contributor to overall cost, and it's followed by cereals, which is the beige bar at the bottom, and then vegetables in green at the top. Next. In terms of affordability, adding in data on wages shows us that while real wages have gone up for both men and women, affordability has actually is actually far worse for women. On the left-hand side, we have the hours adjusted real wages, again in 2011 rupees. Across the time span of our data set, we see that real wages have increased for both men and women, but more so for men, with that gap widening towards the end of our data. So when we calculate chord as a percentage of these hours adjusted wages, as we do in the right-hand side panel, we find that diets are considerably more expensive as a proportion of women's hours adjusted wages than for men. So the line on top in red shows that the chord costs approximately 80 to 90% of women's hours adjusted daily wages. And the much lower black line at the bottom, which represents the same statistic for men, it shows that the chord is actually 50 to 60% of men's daily wages. So affordability is far worse for women, and that's a combination both of lower overall real wages as well as lower growth of real wages over time. Next slide. And another thing which I think also perhaps came out in the results from Soumya's paper that were presented earlier is that seasonality really matters. So it's not as though affordability is a single concept that can be applied across the year. It matters at what point in time you're measuring the cost of these diets. So if we look at prices by food group, which is the left-hand side panel here, you can see that for several of these food groups, there's not a lot of seasonality. But for the three series that have been picked out, fruits, vegetables, and dark green leafy vegetables, prices tend to peak towards the middle of the year, so somewhere between May to September, and then are lower in the winter months. And so correspondingly, when one calculates the chord relative to wages, particularly for occupations where there's not a lot of seasonality in wages, the affordability metric follows much the same pattern. So on the right-hand side, when we're looking at chord relative to wages for male unskilled laborers, we can see that the affordability is actually lowest between June and August. In other words, the chord as a percentage of wages is the highest in those sort of middle months of the year. Next slide. So the last thing we did in this paper is that since we had information on how much the cost, what the cost of a recommended diet was, we also wanted to calculate the proportion of the rural population that would actually be able to afford such a diet. So the top panel takes estimates from our paper. So the cost of a recommended diet for women as of June 2011 was 45.1 rupees. Converting this to purchasing power dollars gives us a chord of $3.01 per day. And just a reminder again that the World Bank poverty line is 1.9. So this is considerably higher, as Rachel mentioned before, than the World Bank stipulated poverty line. We then provide two estimates, two benchmarks to kind of give a sense of the magnitude of the unaffordability problem. So the estimate one, which is the middle panel, it's a lower benchmark. Here we assume somewhat unrealistically that households spend all of their income on food. And when you assume that, then we still find that 63.3% of the rural population would not be able to afford this $3 chord. So that's almost two-thirds of the population. Then when we add in a 63 cent per day non-food spending requirement, and by the way, this is approximately one third of the World Bank poverty line, then the cord goes up to $3.64 per day, and then the proportion of the rural population that can't afford the cord rises to more than 3/4. And I saw a question, it just flashed onto my screen about the PDS. And so no, there's an extensive section in our paper which deals with limitations. We do not have information on PDS, nor do we have information on sourcing from common property resources. So those are two things that would tend to lower this. But then, as Rachel mentioned, things like taking into account household sizes, because right now we're doing this at an individual level. But of course, you have kids also who are dependents on wage earners, but also accounting for tastes and preferences would tend to raise the cord. So it's unclear which direction that would go, but the estimates we're presenting here are only based on retail prices. Next slide. Okay, and then completely by chance, we actually got lucky with the timing of when this paper was released. So it came out in the same week that the Global Hunger Index was released last October. That was when the paper first became available. And as many of you who were following the coverage would have known, India did very badly on the hunger index, and that became quite a talking point in the media. We ranked 94 out of 107 nations. And at the same time, there was a study talking about nutrition security and how vast swathes of the rural population can't afford those diets. And so it definitely caused a little bit of a storm and was picked up by a number of national dailies. So that did get attention. And I think more recently, there's also been a little bit more attention around this topic, which bodes well for our updated analysis. Next slide, Rachel. So now I'll talk about what we've been doing since under the Food Prices for Nutrition project. And this, as I mentioned before, the earlier paper ended in 2011. And this is not by design. That's really when the price series ended, and we couldn't really find data that would update this for rural India. But of course, in light of what's been happening as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, it becomes really important for us to think about what is happening to food prices and what's happening to affordability of diets. So several studies have noted adverse initial impacts on the food supply as a result of the pandemic. A lot of this would be familiar to this audience. There's temporary closure of the mandis, the wholesale markets, lots of disruptions, particularly initially to interstate trade, even of essential items like food, the migrant crisis, and a large loss of migrant labor which kind of worked, of course, in the mandis, but also at various points along the supply chain. And so several of these studies, which use data ending approximately at the end of July in 2020, noted that there were initial increases in the prices of certain commodities, pulses, oils, and vegetables, but that by the end, even of the first initial stringent lockdown, which was lifted partially on June the 1st, there were already some signs of recovery. So even though there were these initial impacts on driving up food prices, things seem to kind of revert to a new normal fairly quickly. But when combined with the information we have on rising unemployment rates and falling household incomes, we might still expect that the affordability of these diets has fallen quite considerably as a result of the pandemic. So there was a huge spike in the unemployment rate right after the initial lockdown, which peaked at about 24% in May. While there has been a recovery since, there is some suggestive evidence to show that first, the job loss was worse for women. And second, even for those who are able to transition back into the workforce, there's increased informality or a shift from formal sector employment to self-employment. And a recent State of Working India report estimated that 230 million additional individuals fell below the national minimum wage poverty line. Again, that's 375 rupees a day, which is considerably higher than the World Bank poverty line. So it's important for us to analyze what has been happening over the course of the last year. Next slide, please. It's particularly important in the case of India because a lot of the papers that have already looked at what's been happening to prices have used the actual policies in terms of the lockdowns or unlock 1, unlock 2, and so on, the gradual lifting of restrictions. But in the case of India, what's really curious is that there's a very low correlation between the stringency of the policies that were implemented, mobility, so the measures of how much people are actually moving around, and then COVID-19 cases. So that's very starkly depicted in this graph. In blue, we have the COVID-19 policy stringency index. And as you can see, in the first few months of the lockdown, through the end of March and up until the end of May, we sort of maxed out on this index. So we hit the highest possible score, which was celebrated to some extent in the Indian media. And you can see that the residential mobility, which is calculated from the Google Community Mobility Reports, that's the green line on the bottom, reflects that to some extent. So there's, that residential mobility also peaks at the time of those policy interventions. But the correlation with COVID-19 cases is actually very low. So in fact, the COVID-19 cases, which are reflected by the red bars, peaked at a time around the beginning of October when restrictions were actually being lifted all across the country. So we think that consumer behavior as represented by mobility is a combination both of policy restrictions like lockdowns or restrictions on mobility, but also a behavioral response to things like reported COVID-19 cases. And so in this paper, we wanted to actually relate consumer mobility, which is a combination of those multiple factors, to food prices, rather than using policy proxies. Next slide. So as Rachel mentioned, we're drawing on a whole new set of data sources for this work. One of the things to note is that we're shifting entirely from our focus on rural India to a very strongly urban focus. So on prices, we draw information from 3 different data sets. One is the Department of Consumer Affairs, the other is the National Horticultural Board, and then we have the Ministry of Agriculture. All of these have data for a set of urban centers, and there's some overlap across the 3 data sets. They also have data on a set of different commodities, and again, there's some overlap, but a little less so there. The first 2 data sources have daily retail and wholesale prices, whereas the MOA data set has weekly retail prices. So what we've done in this analysis is that we've combined these 3 sources to produce a weekly district level data set, which spans the period January 2018 to January 2021. We have retail prices for 68 commodities from approximately 150 urban centers, and all prices are deflated using the state month level general urban CPI. Next slide. So what we're combining this price data with is the mobility data that I mentioned before. And this is again data that you might have seen being used quite often in analysis of the impacts of the pandemic. This is data from the Google Community Mobility Reports, and that combines the number of trips you make and the amount of time you spend in each of those trips to give you a sense of how mobility has changed relative to a pre-COVID baseline that's also calculated from in the initial part of 2020 from early January to early February. The Google mobility reports calculate mobility to a number of different locations. What we're using here is the inverse of the residential mobility measure. So they also have mobility for workplaces, for recreational activities, for groceries and pharmacies and so on. But the residential mobility measure, in a sense, is measuring the amount of time you spend at home. And the inverse of that is kind of a catch-all going out mobility index. So that's what we use for our analysis. And again, as I mentioned before, the amount of time you're spending at home could reflect both restrictions on you being able to move out, but also your own responses to what you perceive as the risk of infection. Next slide. So we have 3 initial hypotheses on how prices are related to these mobility measures. The first is the perishables hypothesis, which is that we anticipate significantly different price responses for commodities that can be stored and those that cannot. So perishable foods, fruits, vegetables, animal source foods, have supply chains that are more vulnerable to disruptions and also cannot be kind of stored at home. But on the flip side, the demand for non-perishable foods could actually increase during COVID-19. And I'm sure many of us in the call are familiar with going out and buying huge quantities of rice and pulses in the initial weeks. So there was a lot of hoarding of these non-perishable foods early on. The second hypothesis is an adaptation hypothesis. So we expect that a surprise lockdown induces certain patterns in the initial weeks, but as traders and retailers and consumers kind of settle to the new normal, then things adjust and look quite different. So a lot of the earlier studies that ended at the end of July or in the middle of April might have caught certain patterns in price dynamics that would might not have lasted over the longer term. And then the third hypothesis is a city size hypothesis, which is that we anticipate differences between small and large cities. And this one is a bit ambiguous in the direction in which it would go. A lot of the mega cities, Delhi, Bombay, were more affected by COVID-19 in the first wave, also had more strict prevention strategies, more strictly implemented lockdowns. And so that could have affected mobility, but also affected supply chains. On the other hand, smaller cities, less attention was paid to stabilizing supply chains there, but they also had shorter supply chains. So it's a little ambiguous which way this effect will go. Next slide. So just quickly to look at mobility by city size classifications, what we're presenting here is on the left, the residential mobility inverted, which is our main mobility measure for this paper. And then just as a source of comparison, we're also presenting the grocery and pharmacy mobility. Patterns across all the different types of mobility are roughly the same. So what we see is that in the gray shaded portion on each graph, which represents the period of the lockdown, there's a dramatic decline in both of these forms of mobility, but that the grocery mobility actually recovers to the pre-COVID levels, which are at zero, recovers to those levels much faster. So you find that people are still spending more time at home as measured by the residential mobility, even all the way out at the end of 2020. What we also note is that there are some differences in mobility across city size type. So we see the largest reductions in mega cities. Again, this might be because of more stringently implemented lockdowns, and smaller reductions in the small cities, which are represented by the blue line on the top. Next slide. This slide again overlays the lockdown period and also at the bottom in gray, the residential mobility onto the patterns in retail prices by various different food groups over the course of 2020. So again, if we focus just on that gray shaded lockdown portion, you can see that vegetable prices show a lot of volatility. They declined steeply during that period, but declined steeply during that period, but are also overall more volatile. And that might be something that is fairly normal. If you look at the seasonality of these prices, there tends to be more fluctuation. Pulse prices rise by about 10 to 20% after the lockdown is imposed. Prices of animal sourced foods actually fall by about 10%. A lot of this is driven by poultry because of initial scares that chickens were transmitting COVID-19. And otherwise, we see a modest increase in cereal prices and in food prices and dairy barely moves. Next slide. So I'm going to take a little bit of time just to explain what we're doing here. So here we're tracking the relationship between deviations in price in 2020 from pre-COVID prices. So the price for a particular commodity in a particular market in a week in 2020 relative to the same price for the same commodity in the same market in the same week of 2018 or 2019. And we're relating that price deviation to deviations in mobility. So in a sense, we're calculating a sort of elasticity between price and mobility. And here what I'm presenting is that relationship as it evolves over the course of 2020, separately for each of the food groups on which we have information. So what I've picked out the lockdown months, which were sort of the end of March and then all of April and May. This is the first initial stringent lockdown. Just to give you a sense of where that lockdown period is occurring. And just to kind of summarize what we're seeing here. So cereals, oils, and pulses show very little movement, and that might make sense because they're non-perishables that can be stored fairly easily. We do see greater impacts for perishables, In particular, if you look at the vegetables graph, you can see that in the initial periods of lockdown, there's a strong negative association between deviations in prices and deviations in mobility. In other words, reduced mobility during the initial periods of lockdown was associated with higher vegetable prices. And dairy is a kind of distinct value chain in itself, so I'm happy to take questions on that. I'm not presenting here the results disaggregated by city size, but we do see some interesting patterns happening in mega cities that are not reflected in smaller cities. Next slide. So just to summarize what we found so far, and this work is very preliminary, so I really welcome your comments on this or ideas of what we should be exploring. So in the perishables hypothesis, this is partially confirmed. So we do see some differences across perishables and non-perishables. The prices of vegetables increased during lockdown, but fruit prices declined, and cereal, oil, and dairy prices sort of increased only marginally, if at all. In terms of the adaptation hypothesis, again, substantially confirmed. So some of our initial results in the period of the lockdown are similar to the results from other papers that kind of ended their analysis soon after the first lockdown ended. But then because we extend that time series, we can actually confirm that while the lockdown periods generally show larger elasticities between mobility and prices, these do tend to converge to some kind of new normal over time. And in the case of some commodities, that adaptation is fairly quick and it takes a bit more time for other commodities. And then lastly, I'm not showing these results, but I'm happy to share a longer version of this presentation. We do actually find some quite significant differences across small and big cities, especially in the early months of the lockdown. And that might be related to that mobility graph that I showed as well. So dairy and fruit prices go down quite significantly in large cities. And we believe that this reflects demand shocks more than supply shocks. So a lot of the demand for dairy that comes from, say, weddings or festivals, restaurants, hotels, cafes, all of that kind of collapsed in the first lockdown. But we do find that cereal prices also seem to fall only in the large cities. And there are some other differences, nuances across the various city types that I would be happy to discuss. Next slide. So to conclude and just give a little bit of a direction of where we're planning to go with this work going forward. So I know that the main focus of this is the cost of diet work, and that is kind of where we're aiming with this analysis. So the next piece of this, and I believe Anita is on the call who's helping me work on this, is to actually calculate an updated cohort measure using the data we have for the period 2020, but also perhaps to extend it a little bit further back, since we do have data for earlier years as well. So just a reminder, our earlier work using the data up until 2011 showed that the largest contributors to cost were dairy, vegetables, and cereals. So in terms of what we've seen over the course of COVID-19, dairy, there was little change overall. But for both vegetables and cereals, we do see an increase in prices over the initial part of the lockdown, a larger increase in the case of vegetables than cereals. So it's possible that the cost of a recommended diet has gone up. It's also possible that there are differences in how that cost of a recommended diet has changed depending on what city size you belong to. So impacts might be slightly larger in smaller cities. And we also noted that adaptation or recovery in many cases have actually taken longer in the smaller cities. So while the mega cities might have had a larger initial impact, they recovered fairly quickly. And part of that might be policy measures aimed at stabilizing supply chains in these large cities, but that smaller cities are still far from the new normal. That's all I had. This is ongoing work, and I'm happy to take any questions now or later. Thanks.
Yeah, I think we can take a couple of minutes now if people have questions for Kalyani specifically. I'll share a little bit more after this, and then we can have another Q&A if people don't have questions now. Kalyani, there are two questions I think you could weigh in on. Sumya asked, can you, Jan responded for the larger project, but can you share if the edible portions that you've used in your work are country specific? I ask because in our work, we've used edible portions from the USDA. I'd be interested to know if this data is available specifically for India. Do you have any
Yeah.
more thoughts on that?
Yeah, just to reiterate what you also presented, Soumya, the National Institute for Nutrition in their dietary guidelines for Indians, which I believe has also been updated recently, actually has that table that Rachel put up in her presentation, which gives for each of the different food groups, it gives the gram per portion, so the serving size, and then the number of servings for each. Depending on what type of activity you're doing, is it sedentary or is it intense activity, and then by male and female. So I think I have the dietary guidelines as of 2011. I believe they were updated, and I haven't updated my own analysis, but I'm happy to share that with you after the call. Yeah, so that is just for India. I think I answered the PDS question. If there are any other questions, you can also just unmute and ask.
Okay, I don't see any immediately. I'll continue on and then we can stop. One question that I think would be interesting to answer maybe at the end, Kalyani, is what are some of the implications for sort of the volatility in some of these food groups? If there's any like specific policy that you guys have thought of that would be very useful either for a specific food group or maybe for reducing some of the volatility or speeding up the recovery in some of these smaller cities, maybe that's something we can touch on if there's time in the next Q&A session if people don't have questions. But I'll just quickly continue on. I just want to talk a little bit more about the next steps for the Food Prices for Nutrition project in general. So I mentioned a little bit of this, and this is all on our website as well, but really the focus of this project is to scale up the monitoring and analysis of food prices to guide agricultural production and food markets towards improved nutrition. So we're definitely focused on using the food prices and the diet quality or the diet cost metrics specifically to influence policy. And we're focused on supporting the use of the metrics in high priority countries. So we have 9 focus countries, of which India is one. Another goal is to build a global system to monitor change in food prices for nutrition. So Jan, who was just on the call from the World Bank, is working with other people at the World Bank to implement a data hub for sharing some of the diet cost metrics that have already been calculated in the SOFI report. So that should be coming out soon. And then another important pillar of the Food Prices for Nutrition project is, of course, to analyze the change in the cost and affordability of healthy diets. So work like what Kalyani's just presented. So there will be a lot more of that from IFPRI and Tufts and the World Bank as well in the coming years. And we're very interested in interacting with people in the high priority countries, including India, to find out what some of the research priorities are, what some of the main questions are. So that's, I'll come back to it in a moment, but we are putting together sort of food price interest groups to gather information from people who have sort of more specific questions or deeper interest in some of these topics to find out what's the most useful type of research that we can be doing in this project. I'll just quickly, oops, sorry, it's the wrong next slide. Yeah, of course. I'm not seeing exactly.
My name is Dr. Gauri Ramesh, and I'm an associate professor at Women's Christian College in Chennai, India. So it was a very interesting one, although this is not something totally that we are into. We don't really do this price analysis and all. So this was something new to me. But one thing I just wanted to probably, this is my perception on affordability. When we have like foods which are like more, like empty calories and all, they are more affordable compared to your fruits and vegetables. So I see a lot of people just heading out to buy that because they can afford to buy that and eat, and it's like filling. So that's one way that they do not consume fruits or vegetables, and it's easier to buy, cheaper to buy those. And maybe that is one reason why they're not focused on eating, healthier options like fruits and vegetables. So if you can think of, like, some policymakers can think of actually hiking up the cost of these junk foods, then maybe we can make them buy fruits, seasonal fruits, which definitely will be cheaper, and they will be able to develop a taste, because these processed foods have a kind of taste which people adapt to very fast, and they do not want to give up on it once they like that. So that's one of the reasons we are seeing among college students also, they tend to eat more of the processed foods and they don't want to look at the healthier options. So that's something that I think we need to look into in the long run to create a healthy atmosphere.
Yeah, that's a really interesting comment. Kalyani, I'm definitely interested to hear if you have any specific thoughts on this. I think it's something that's a great addition to what the metrics and the food price analysis that this project is focused on can do. I think an important, going back to the ladder of affordability, one of the important insights I think that this project has tried to highlight is that for many people, there is certainly a component of behavior change and nutrition education and talking to people about what foods are healthy and sort of shifting demand. I would say that most of our focus has been on demonstrating that for many people, it's not even possible to afford even calorie adequacy. So there are still people all over the world, particularly in South Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa, who can't even afford calorie adequacy. So we have focused traditionally, I mean, in this project on that, as opposed to the drivers of food choices within that. But I think it's an extremely important question. It comes up very often, is that the relative prices of food obviously really influence people's decisions. Kalyani, did you want to add to that, or?
I would just add to reiterate that this is something that we touch upon also in our affordability paper, but also I think overall the Poverty, Health and Nutrition Division and others at IFPRI have been raising this for a while. So we've done, some of my colleagues have done analysis on the NSS data, just looking at the increasing amount that is spent on snack foods or on eating out, so unhealthy foods, and exactly what you just said, that there's sharply rising trend over recent years in the amount of money that goes towards consuming those. And as Rachel said, it's partly a demand side issue. So it's educating and behavioral change and making people aware of the choices that they're making, but it's partly also the supply issue, which is what we're sort of getting at in this analysis. And if there was sort of a private sector equivalent that marketed these foods the way you market, say, kurkure. I mean, all of us who have been to the smallest market, rural market, there's always biscuits, there's always kurkure of that kind. So if we could replicate that model, I think we would be living in a very different world. So it's a bit of both, but the point that Rachel is making, that even if you had full information and you knew exactly what you wanted to buy, that you'd still not be able to afford it, I think it's still important to document that. But thanks for your question. Totally agree.
Thank you so much for answering. And I think as policymakers, because we are in the academic side, so we don't really have a say in this. So if the policymakers can actually look into it, even in schools, I have done work on childhood obesity. That is my area of focus. And I feel there is a lot of trend towards, even children, when you talk to them, they are quite receptive and they would like to change, but the environment is not very conducive for those kind of, so when it is available, they do, they tend to bend towards that. So I guess we need to really look into it if we are talking about affordability and accessibility and all these pointers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kalyani and Rachel. This is Shweta Khandelwal from Public Health Foundation of India. I'm really impressed with this body of work. And despite working in the field of nutrition for the last 16, 17 years, sometimes you miss these nitty-gritties of such essential pieces of food prices, for example. I always talk about reducing them, but today I got a sneak preview of how these things are calculated and what are we talking for. 2 points, I don't know if they're questions or really comments, but I would like to hear your views on. Number one is about sustainability and climate change. So given the current pandemic, as well as this whole focus for One Health, this whole paradigm shift of just pushing for affordable diets to also having this climate sensitive or being, from that angle, was any, or in your future analysis, would you be taking into account some kind of climate resilient cropping mechanisms or agriculture patterns and things like those, costing for those? That's my first question. And the second is about capacity. We hear that in India 2000 farmers are leaving farming every day. Farming is also going to be digitalized and technologically mechanized in some ways. And that, while it will bring the cost of price for the nutrition, for the food maybe, but will it be very nutritious still? Will it be, just harmonized pieces or blended, pulverized pieces of not junk, I should say, but things we have to consume in packages or packets like we do for other things? So, some thought around those kind of real issues. How do we integrate those two? Maybe it's helpful for future work, or maybe these are just absurd things. I'm sorry, but I thought these are important from a public health nutrition angle. Thank you. Over to you.
So I can give a quick response, essentially to say, yes, those are great points, Shweta, and thanks a lot. Rachel actually might know more about this, but I read a paper recently that did for Mexico. It did a comparison of an Eat Lancet type of diet, but then there's also a type of diet that takes into account these sustainability issues that you're looking at. And so you can have various types of diets, one that meets your in-country food-based dietary guidelines, one that matches, say, a more global set of guidelines, and then one that takes the global healthy nutrition guidelines and it adds in these sustainability bits. And my memory from that paper is that, just like the ladder that Rachel showed, that when you add in concerns around sustainability, you're likely to increase the cost of this diet even further. So I'm not sure if Rachel has anything to add on what that diet is called. I forget, but I can look it up and send it to you. And the second, around capacity, I don't have any answers. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on the call, but point absolutely well taken. And I think we're at this point in particular, we don't really know where we're going in terms of how our farming is going to look over the next few decades. So whatever we can do to kind of push the discourse towards promoting horticultural crops, promoting more diversity in production, and then supporting the supply of that to people, we'll do. Yeah. So Rachel, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I don't have too much to add. I was also going to mention the Eat Lancet, the costing of the Eat Lancet diet, which others have done. It's not the only way to incorporate sustainability into the mix. Certainly, there should be other ways. I believe I'm going to try and go back to a previous slide, or maybe when I share the slides, you can look back. The Eat Lancet diet was costed in the SOFI 2020 report as one of the 10 food-based dietary guidelines. And if I recall correct, on the global average level, I believe that the Eat Lancet diet costs, which incorporate sustainability, were not altogether that much higher than other food-based dietary guidelines. I'm sure that varies because the data I presented earlier is a global average. So I can't right now speak to it specifically for India. Soumya's work costed the Eat Lancet diet in rural India. Soumya, if you wanted to share that paper, I can do it.
Yeah, I'm aware about that literature.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah, those are IFPRI researchers also. They have published the Indianized version of Eat Lancet, and they've costed. My point was not that, but anyway, the reason I was bringing that up was essentially to see that climate sustainability from Indian localized context is accounted for. So Eat Lancet, as you know, one of the criticisms has been that it's not fairly uniform across the globe, the patterns, and certain countries like ours, which are not great meat eaters, have been asked to, what kind of options do we have and things like those. But nevertheless, Kalyani already made that point. So I'm all right. I'll probably shut up right now. So I'll let you carry on. Okay.
No, thanks. I also just wanted to say that another huge portion of the project, and what I'm largely tasked with, is to generate conversation around these metrics and around food prices, because I think it is hard to think of good solutions, and it's not always obvious what's included and how sort of agricultural policy should be shifted. So I'll move forward just for a moment in the presentation, just to mention, well, I'll say a quick thank you to our donors, but the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the FCDO, who have been funding this work for quite a while. We are developing tools to calculate the cost of a healthy diet to make this process a little bit easier, but I'll skip over that and mention quickly that there's going to be an open learning campus course, which is, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's a free course on the World Bank platform. So this will be a 3-hour course that's focused on particularly government officials. So there will be 2 modules. There's sort of the general calculation of the diet cost indices, but also the use and potential applications of the diet cost metrics in relation to policymaking. I think this is a huge point, and it's actually very difficult, which is why, of course, I asked Kalyani that hard question about, like, what are the policy implications of the work? And I think we really want to have conversations at the national level and possibly even subnational level to help facilitate ideas, either about further research that can help really target policymaking, and also to bring policymakers and civil society into the mix, because really we want the cost of a healthy diet metric, I think, is a very useful tool for advocacy. Actually, it is, if it's used as a monitoring tool, and it can be used by civil society advocates, it can be used to push for specific changes. It's just a matter of making that possible and making it an understood metric that people can regularly see how it's changing over time in specific locations. So that's part of the monitoring effort, and then have sort of a venue to advocate for specific changes. So that's an important aspect of this project. And I will quickly throw my email up there and the feedback link, because what we really want to do is hear from people who are interested in engaging in sort of these smaller discussions about how to implement the monitoring of the cost of a healthy diet in India and in our other priority countries, and to understand what we can do to bring in civil society or policymakers, so that these are not just presentations where we talk about the metrics and nothing happens. That's part of my role. So I'll share my email for anyone who's interested, and you can also use the link, the feedback link, to register interest in further correspondence with the project when we have these tools. And also, just in the short term, we'll be putting together food price interest groups to start these conversations. I see let me quickly read these questions. Can I send the link to the webinar mentioned? So if you're, for Erin's question for the webinar, I think you might be referring to the Open Learning Campus course, which will be launched in August 2022. So it is under development right now. It is a long process to get that going. So we'll be launching it next year. We're working on the other tools now, but if you want to register interest with this in this feedback form, that's great. We'll be sharing all of the tools as we have them. And then we'll also be notifying people about the launch of the World Bank course, which, as I said, will be in 2022. And so I just shared that feedback form in the chat, and then my email address as well, if anyone wants to reach out directly. Other questions? Directly relevant to the state budget deliberations going on right now. Got it. Oh, that's also for Israel. Okay. And do we have information on countries already using this approach in policy work, a global list of best practice? Yeah, so this project originated in Ghana and Tanzania, and some of this is being implemented in Ghana, but not exactly the monitoring of the diet cost itself, but rather the larger number of food items and the food group costs over time are being monitored in Ghana, and we're continuing to work with them in this project in order to scale up the monitoring. We're working with Nigeria for the United Nations Food System Summit. They are working on monitoring the cost of a healthy diet now, so we're supporting that, and we're very interested in. We're focused on the 9 priority countries, but we are interested in interacting with other countries who are interested, or other stakeholders in other countries who want to use these different metrics, mostly the cost of a healthy diet. Let's see, I think that's great. Yeah, well, we're about 5 minutes over. So I think with that, we'll wrap up unless there's any last question, and we'll really appreciate your feedback in the forum. And I appreciate everyone's time. And Kalyani, thank you so much for a really interesting presentation. That was wonderful to have you here.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks everyone who joined.
Thanks so much. All right.